In this video, we take a look at interior lighting in V-Ray for 3ds Max. I'm just going to keep it as simple as possible and show you at least 3 approaches that you can take for interior lighting. So let's get started with the first approach, which is a combination of a white dome light and a V-Ray sun. I'm looking at my scene through a V-Ray camera that has an exposure value of around 10. The lower the exposure value here, the more light will enter the camera. For an interior shot, I normally use something between 8 to 11 and 11 to 14 for exterior shots. Here I'm using 10 to get started, and we can adjust it later on. Also, the scene has a gray V-Ray material as its override material. If I open up the material editor, this is the material that's being applied as the override material to the entire scene. I'm using a slightly brighter gray value at 185 compared to the default value, which is a mid-gray at 128. So let's add a V-Ray dome light to the scene and run the IPR. As always, we are using ACES as our color manager, so make sure to provide the correct config file in the VFB. Obviously, the scene is too dark and I know my camera exposure is in a proper range for an interior shot. So let's start increasing the dome light multiplier to 10, 20, 30, and maybe 40. It's a bit too bright. We can probably get back to our camera and set the exposure value to around 11 to let a bit less light through the shutter. Obviously, you can play around with the light multiplier instead, but let's kind of mix between the two. So that is the first step. This gives us a nice overall soft lighting to work with, and if you check the alpha channel, because effect alpha is disabled in the dome light options, it won't affect the alpha channel. So you can take your render to Photoshop, After Effects, Fusion, or any other post-processing application and simply place your desired background picture behind the windows. Now we can add a V-Ray sun to the scene. Let's do it from the top view. I have these helper dummies to help me with the direction of the sunlight. Make sure to check out the previous video about V-Ray sun and sky. Now V-Ray asks to add the sky as well, as we have the white dome light. We don't really need V-Ray sky, so say no. Let me make sure the sun has a proper height so it can shine through the windows. We can play around with the direction and the height of the sun to get different looks. So it's really up to you. Especially when you're using a white dome as your environment, it can be easier to place the sun the way you like. I'm just going to align it to this helper dummy. And let's wait a bit to see what we get. So this is your most basic interior lighting setup. We can open up the layer panel and add a white balance correction and set the temperature to around 6200 to get rid of some of that warmer tones. And really that's it. Now for the final render, let's go to the render settings. I'm going to decrease the noise threshold to 0.005. Add a V-Ray denoiser render element. And now we can start the final render. I'm just going to show you the saved render in the history panel. Here it is. Looks good. A very simple setup that gives you a very neutral look. So that is the first setup. I will save out each setup for you so you can access them in the project files. For now, let me reopen this scene to start from scratch. Now, the second method involves a simple V-Ray sun and sky. So let's add a V-Ray sun from the top view. Great. This time we need a V-Ray sky to be added to the environment. So say yes. And let's place it at the same height like the previous setup and start the IPR again. I'm going to just select the sun and make sure the sky model is set to improved. As we'll learn, this will give us a bit more realistic colors and ranges. Now, if I lower the sun a bit closer to the horizon, we will get a lot more warmer, darker tones. I can go even lower. maybe higher again. And you can obviously adjust the camera exposure at this point to get exactly what we want. So this setup gives you more flexibility compared to the previous setup. The V-Ray Sky colors will give you kind of richer tones. For this setup to be a bit more optimized, we need to make sure that the V-Ray Sky affects the scene through a V-Ray dome light. Because as we learned from the dome light lesson, dome light has an option called adaptive dome, which optimizes the dome light for interior shots. So this will result in faster renders. So I'm gonna add a V-Ray dome light to the scene and go to its modify panel. Press A to open up environment and effects window and instance that V-Ray Sky texture into the dome light texture. And that's it. You would get the exact same result, but now we are using our V-Ray Sky texture through a dome light, which has this adaptive dome feature enabled by default. If you have used V-Ray before, this adaptive dome feature basically replaces the whole concept of placing light portals behind windows. And now if I start moving my sun a bit lower, the dome light should respond correctly. Sometimes you need to refresh the IPR, but it works properly after that. And because our dome light does not affect the alpha channel, we can simply replace this boring background with a much more interesting skyline or sky texture in post quite easily. And again, we can add a simple white balance and use something like 6000 or 6200 to make the render a bit more neutral. It all depends on what you like, but I like it to be a bit more neutral so I can have a bit more to work with in post. And that's it. Now for the final render, the same thing, simply decrease the threshold to 0.005 and add a V-Ray denoiser. Now if you go to the GI tab, we are using basically brute force and light cache, which is the default settings for GI or global illumination in V-Ray, and I really don't change them. We will talk about global illumination later on. Now you can go ahead and start the render. But let me just show you the final render from the history panel. If you feel the render might look a bit flat, you can do some basic color correction right here in the VFB using a curve or an exposure or a contrast adjustment. Or we can do obviously our color correction in post. Okay, let's reopen the starting scene and take a look at another approach. For this method, we'll be using HDRI images and V-Ray Sun, and this method will give you a bit more to work with compared to the two previous methods, because you can use different HDRIs with different lighting and different times of day and get very different overall tone and feel. So add a dome light and go to its modify panel and run the IPR. Now we can load any HDRI. Go to the HDRI folder in your Scene Assets Images folder, and let's load this The Sky is on Fire HDRI from HDRI Haven. We can increase the multiplier to 3 probably, and this is the result. And now we can obviously introduce V-Ray Sun to the mix. Before that, let's try another HDRI. Now quickly open up the material editor and instance the HDRI map there. First, let me change the RGB color space to sRGB primaries. And this time load this Sky Sunset HDRI. And now we can increase the dome light multiplier maybe to something like 40. And now we have introduced all of the colors from this particular HDRI to the scene, and you can experiment with a few other HDRIs. But for now, let's stick with this one. We can obviously use this horizontal rotation to rotate the HDRI and get different looks by each rotation. Let's try 50. 100, 150, 200, 250, 300. I think let's try 50 for now. Now we can add V-Ray Sun. We don't want any V-Ray Sky in this case, so let's say no. And from the front view, change the height of the sun as you like. Obviously, you need to use basic common sense here. You don't have to use V-Ray Sun all the time. It's not always sunny, so you can stick with a simple HDRI image and drive your lighting completely from that and don't use V-Ray Sun at all. And some of the HDRIs have basically a sun element themselves, so you don't really have to use V-Ray Sun in that case as well, and just simply move the HDRI around until the sun from that HDRI shines through the windows. But in this case, we can go ahead and let's get back to our material editor. And for the final try, let's load this Fright Station HDRI from HDRI Haven again. And set the horizontal rotation to 120 degrees. Let's increase the dome light multiplier to around 60. And now we can start the final render. Just go to the render settings. Unlike the other renders, decrease the noise threshold to 0.005 again and add a V-Ray denoiser. I'm just going to show you the result in the history panel. Again, we can use a white balance and decrease the temperature to around 6,200, maybe. And it really depends on your taste. Okay, that looks good. Obviously, we can use something like an exposure and maybe add a bit more contrast or use a curve. Just to control the overall look right from the VFB, or you can obviously do it in post depending on what you want. Maybe you can add a color balance layer and make the shadows a bit bluer. It really depends on you. So in this video, we learned about interior lighting in V-Ray for 3ds Max. See you in the next one.